In this lecture, we're going to take a look at epithelial tissue. First, let's look at epithelial characteristics. Epithelial tissue consists almost entirely of cells. In other words, there's no filler material, nothing kind of gapping or in between the cells. The cells are butted up right against each other. And epithelial tissues are going to cover body surfaces. They are also going to form glands. And how we tell an epithelial tissue from the other tissues, remember there are 4 types of tissues: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. How we tell them from the other tissues is that it's going to have, first of all, a free surface. So a free surface. In other words, there's nothing on top of it. It's not sandwiched in between other tissues like, say, connective tissue is. I think of it as like tile on a floor. The tile on the floor has a free surface, and that's the part that we're able to walk on. But it also has a basal surface. And that basal surface is what's attached to the underlying concrete or wood subflooring. Okay, and the same here. We have a basal surface, and it's almost kind of glued down to the connective tissue below. As a matter of fact, we have what's called a basement membrane, and that basement membrane is what's going to cement that epithelial tissue to the connective tissue below that. And there are also some specialized cell contacts. We're not really going to go into those in detail, but things like gap junctions, tight junctions, things like that, which hold the cells together. And they all have very specific functions. Another thing about epithelial tissue is that it's avascular. Avascular means there is no blood supply. I don't know if you've ever done this as a kid, but you take a needle or a straight pin and you kind of put it right up under your skin and gross people out. Show them that little pin or needle just under the skin. Now, did that bleed when you did that? No, it didn't. Did it hurt? Probably not. Now, if you were like me, you'd get carried away and maybe you went a little too deep. Now we've gone past the epithelial tissue and we've gone down into the connective tissue. And yes, that hurt. It might have bled a little bit. But while we were staying in the epithelial tissue, it did not bleed because, again, epithelial tissue is avascular and has no blood supply. Another characteristic of epithelial tissue is that it undergoes mitosis. It's constantly dividing and replacing itself. The epithelial tissue that lines our digestive tract is constantly sloughing off old cells. We're constantly creating new. The epithelial tissue of our skin, again, we're constantly sloughing off the old cells just through abrasion and wear and tear, and we're making new cells. So those cells are constantly undergoing mitosis. Some of the other functions of epithelial tissue is it's going to protect underlying structures. It's going to act as a barrier. Think about your skin. Your skin is a barrier. It's the first line of defense against infection or disease. It keeps dirt and foreign substances from contacting the structures beneath. So it acts as a barrier. Also permits the passage of substances. And I kind of tag that in with this down here, absorb substances. But we can allow the passage of substances either through diffusion or, let's see, I'm trying to think. Like in the digestive system, for instance, the digestive epithelium is going to allow for the passage of nutrients, amino acids, proteins, fats. Those things are going to actually pass through the epithelium and goes into the, like the nutrients, for instance, are going to go into the bloodstream. Okay, some of the types of fats are going to be absorbed right through the epithelium and into the lymphatic system, into a structure called a lacteal. We also secrete substances. For instance, our skin secretes perspiration, secretes oils. Our digestive system secretes mucus. It secretes enzymes. And then back to absorbing again. For instance, if we put something on our skin, like for instance, if someone is having a heart attack, sometimes we take a paste of nitroglycerin and we put that little paste over their sternum, and that nitroglycerin gets absorbed into the skin and into the heart, and it allows the coronary arteries to dilate. Now, classification of epithelium. The first thing we want to do is look at the different layers of epithelial tissue. And that's actually the first way we name it as well. If it's one cell layer thick, we're going to call it simple. So I think about it again like the tile on the floor, one tile layer thick. Or for instance, at my house I have a paver patio. That is one layer of bricks thick. But I could take those bricks and I can stack them up into many layers and form a retaining wall. Well, that is going to be called stratified. So if we have two or more layers, we're going to call that tissue stratified. A strata is a layer. Now there is one group of tissues that tricks us. It looks like it's stacked up because you see when we look at simple epithelium, usually the nuclei, which are found right in the center of the cells, are going to be lined up in a nice row. If we look at stratified epithelium, we're going to have multiple nuclei at different levels. But pseudostratified, we have nuclei all at different levels, so it looks like cells are stacked up on each other, but in reality, they are all touching the basement membrane. They're all attached to the basement membrane. They're not stacked on anything. Not all of the cells are going to reach the surface, but they are all attached to the basement membrane. To me, it kind of reminds me of a parade. If you're in the parade and you're looking at the audience, the audience is going to be standing, at the curb. You're going to have little kids. You're going to have taller kids. You're going to have adults. You're going to have moms and dads, and everybody's going to be a little different height, and they're all kind of smushed together, trying to get a view of the parade. And while everybody is standing on the ground, not everybody reaches up to the same level as far as height. Same thing with pseudostratified epithelium. The next way we're going to classify epithelium is by shape. The first shape is squamous, which means flat. So on edge, these cells are going to look flat. If we take a look at them from above, they're going to look kind of like a fried egg. The next shape is kind of cube-shaped, and so we're going to call that cuboidal. Our next shape is going to be taller than it is wide, so it looks like a column, and so we're going to call that columnar. And then our last shape can kind of fool us because when we are trying to determine what type of tissue it is, it almost looks like it is cuboidal. But you see where we find this particular tissue, and actually it's found in the urinary bladder. That's one of the places it's found. As the urinary bladder begins to fill up, these cells are able to flatten out and stretch. Oh, they flatten out. So which cell type is that going to be? If you guessed squamous, you're correct. So it goes from squamous to, when you empty the bladder, it puffs back up into kind of this irregular cuboidal shape. And so it's going to transition from flat to kind of puffy. I always think they look like kind of puffy little marshmallows. So that's why we call it transitional. Depending on whether it's stretched or not, it's going to transition from one shape to another. And now here, this is a very important tip. When you're trying to classify epithelium and name that epithelium, and if it's a stratified epithelium, always name it according to the top layer of cells. If you look at the bottom layer of cells, they're all going to look cuboidal or columnar. Okay, so you have to look at the top layer. And take a look at that sometime, and we'll be looking at it in just a bit. But like stratified squamous epithelium, you look at those bottom layers of cells, some look cuboidal, some look columnar, but you look at the very top and you'll notice that they're starting to flatten out, till we have some very flat cells. Okay, so always don't forget, always remember to look at the top layer of cells to name epithelial tissue. Okay, simple squamous epithelium. It's a single layer of flat cells. It's going to line blood vessels. We call that the endothelium. It can line the body cavities. We call that the mesothelium. It's very thin, controls diffusion, osmosis, filtration. The nuclei are centrally located, and the cells are in direct contact with one another. Okay. Now, is this the type of epithelium you'd expect to find as your skin? I hope you said no, because this is only one cell layer thick, so it's not going to provide enough protection from abrasion. So you scrape off that one cell layer, and that's it. Okay. So our cells, our skin cells, are most likely going to be, and actually they are, stratified squamous epithelium. But here's an example again of simple squamous. Another place, if we think of diffusion, where would we want simple squamous epithelium? It's also found in the air sacs of the lung, because we want that tissue to be as thin as possible to allow oxygen to diffuse back and forth. And here's a view from above. And again, we can see the cells are very flat looking. This picture doesn't really look like fried eggs, but again, if you do like a cheek scraping with a toothpick, put that out onto a slide, stain it, it's going to have this fried egg appearance. Over here, we're looking at simple epithelium from the edge. Very difficult to pick this out, but it's going to be just this very, very thin edge. And let's move on. So here's simple cuboidal epithelium. It's a single layer of cube-shaped cells as viewed from the side. The nuclei are round and centrally located. It's going to line the tubes of the kidneys, and it's for absorption or secretion. And if we look here, this probably isn't the best picture. I've seen better. And don't forget to Google all of these tissues, because you're going to have to train your eye. They're not all going to look exactly the same. And here's something I want to point out right here. If you think this looks like stratified cuboidal epithelium, well, it's not. This is simple cuboidal epithelium. You see, if it were stratified, you wouldn't have this material in between. The cells would be right up against each other, forming multiple layers. Okay, this is just one tube here and another tube here. They're just very close to each other. And again, you know it's not stratified because it does have material in between. The next tissue is nonciliated simple columnar epithelium. It's a single layer of rectangular cells. It's going to have unicellular glands called goblet cells, and these goblet cells secrete mucus. It's going to lubricate the gastrointestinal tract. Here we're going to find it in the respiratory tract, the reproductive and urinary systems. And again, these unicellular glands, these goblet cells, are pretty interesting when you see those under the microscope. Again, it does secrete mucus. Now at the top here, we have these finger-like projections called microvilli. They are very small. They don't move. Cilia move. Cilia are long and they move. Microvilli, what they do is they increase the surface area of the cell. And for instance, if you find this in the gastrointestinal tract, we want to increase the surface area as much as possible in order to come in contact with as many of the nutrients as possible in order to absorb as much nutrients as possible. So you're going to find this all throughout the gastrointestinal tract, from basically the stomach to what's that planet near Neptune? Oh yeah, Uranus. And so here's an example from the small intestine. And as you can see, this little strip here is going to be the microvilli. Now notice that it's very uniform. Okay, it looks like a nicely trimmed hedge. If you had a brand new toothbrush or hairbrush and look at it, it would kind of look like that, where all the little projections are all nice and even. Well, as a matter of fact, we call this little strip here a brush border. And then here we can see mucus in the goblet cells. Here's the nuclei of all the individual cells. And you can tell that these cells are taller than they are wide, giving them a column shape. So these are columnar epithelium. Now here we have ciliated simple columnar epithelium. It's a single layer of rectangular cells with cilia. Again, cilia do move. And so mucus from the goblet cells are going to be moved by the cilia. It's found in the respiratory system. It's also found in the uterine tubes, also known as the fallopian tubes. In this case, in the fallopian tubes, the beating of these cilia are going to help move sperm and also move the egg, once it's fertilized, down to the uterus. Now here's an example of cilia. Notice it's a lot different than the microvilli. The microvilli was very trimmed looking. This looks like hair. Okay, looks like you put a little gel in the hair. Actually, you did put gel in this hair because that would be the mucus. But doesn't it give kind of a spiky look to it? Okay, so that's how you're going to tell it's cilia. It's going to be longer. It's going to be more hair-like, whereas the microvilli are going to be nice and uniform and tight. And this particular slide is from a fallopian tube. Now let's take a look at stratified squamous epithelium. It's going to be several layers thick. And again, the surface cells are what we're going to look at. And if you take a look, they're flat. If we looked at the bottom, we'd say, oh, I don't know, cuboidal, columnar. No, we look at the top layer, it's flat. Now, it can come in two varieties. We can have keratinized and non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Keratinized would be like your skin, the epidermis. The cell surfaces are dead and filled with keratin. If we look at those under the microscope, it's very flaky looking at the top. Skin comes in either thin skin or thick skin. Thick skin is like on the bottom of your feet, the palms of your hands and your fingertips. If we look at one of those under the microscope, that top layer is going to be extremely flaky and very thick. Now, non-keratinized, we're going to have moist living cells at the surface. Remember, in keratinized, that's all dead cells that we're looking at. Non-keratinized, it's going to be living cells. So you're going to find that like lining the inside of your mouth and cheeks, and also the vaginal canal. And this right here would be an example of non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. And if you notice, the epithelium starts here at the bottom and works its way all the way up to the top. And we have all these different levels in between, starting right here with the basal cells at the very bottom, working our way all the way up to these flattened squamous cells. Here we look at stratified cuboidal epithelium. Now, it is also multi-layered. The surface cells are cuboidal. They're rare in the body. They're only found in sweat gland ducts and the male urethra. Here's an example of stratified columnar epithelium. It's multi-layered. The surface cells are columnar. And again, it's also fairly rare in the body. It's found in very large ducts and also parts of the male urethra. And here's the transitional epithelium I was talking about. If we look right here, you can see that it looks kind of like poofy marshmallows. Now, one thing I want you to take a look at is, and let me just draw this out. I'm going to trace this. Okay, bear with me. What do you think? Is there a resemblance? Okay, coincidence? I think so. Anyway, this is transitional epithelium, and it's epithelium that's found in the urinary bladder, and also the ureters that are coming down from the kidney to the bladder, and it allows that tissue to stretch. So I don't know, maybe this is the look you get on your face when your bladder is full and there's no place to empty that bladder. Just kidding. Anyway, it's going to be multi-layered. The surface cells vary in shape from round to flat if stretched. Again, it gives that kind of poofy marshmallow look. As a matter of fact, here we look like we've got a little marshmallow poofy gummy bear right there. Or right here, this almost looks like a little marshmallow peep, doesn't it? He's kind of upside down. There's his eye, his beak. Okay, maybe it's just me. Anyway, it's going to, again, line the urinary bladder and the ureter. And these top cells, these surface cells, are going to flatten out as the bladder expands. Now here's our pseudostratified columnar epithelium. It's a single cell layer, even though it looks like multiple layers because we see the nuclei all over the place. But all of the cells are attached to the basement membrane. Okay, they all don't reach the surface, but they are all attached to the basement membrane. Nuclei are going to be at varying depths. Again, think of that crowd at along the curb watching the parade. We have people of all different sizes. Okay, the same thing here. All the cells are touching the floor or the basement membrane. Not all of them are reaching the same height. We're going to find these in the respiratory system, such as the trachea. We're going to find it in the male urethra and also the epididymis.